Everybody. My name is Ray Boshara. I'm Vice President and Director of the Asset Building Program here at the New America Foundation. Welcome to today's event, Braving the Weather. I'm pleased to let you know that C-SPAN is covering this event live, if you're wondering what the cameras are. And I know we have some other media in the room as well. The official poverty rate in 2007 was 12.5%, or about 37 million people. Not really changed from 2006. Many people believe that the official poverty rate actually understates poverty, and some would even say severely, by as much 50%, even by half. I know that the President, Senator Dodd, Mark Greenberg, Rebecca Blank, and others are working on a real concerted effort to rethink how we measure poverty. Those of us in the assets field have long thought that if you were to measure poverty in terms of what assets people own, that poverty would be twice what it is as well. And it's very important, of course, how you frame poverty, how you measure it. These have a lot to do with how we end up solving it. We also have data that as the recession gets worse, poverty is likely to get significantly worse. Already the unemployment rate, just as of yesterday, reached 8.5%, and it's projected to go up to 10%. And if it does that, the poverty rate actually climbs up to 15%, which is 1 out of every 7 Americans living in poverty. This is absolutely stunning. It's really remarkable. So there really could not be a better time for us to come together today to cross party, ideological, religious lines in support of a bold agenda to reduce poverty, which is, of course, why we're here today. We have 4 wonderful speakers. Introductions are really not necessary, so I will be brief. The Reverend Jim Wallis is the president and CEO of Sojourners, a best-selling author, public theologian, and commentator. His most recent book is The Great Awakening, 7 Ways to Change the World. Reverend Wallis, I've admired you from afar for many years. It's a pleasure and honor to share the stage with you today. Michael Gerson is the Roger Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and where his work focuses on global health and development, religion, foreign policy, and democracy. Prior to joining the Council, as many of you know, he was a top advisor and speechwriter to President George W. Bush. I had the pleasure of meeting Mike back in 2002, I think at an Esquire party, and I had the honor of working with him when he was in the White House on various proposals to build wealth for the nation's poor, including the proposal we most care about, which is savings accounts at birth. Mark Greenberg is the director of the Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy and at Georgetown, and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he also directed their task force on poverty. And Mark's also on the advisory council of the Spotlight on Poverty effort. Mark's really impressive. He's one of the most thoughtful, astute public servants that I know. And I think there are very few people in this country who've had quite the impact on both poverty debates and laws than Mark. And I hope to be as successful as Mark someday. And finally, my colleague David Gray directs New America's Workforce and Family Program. And before that, he was an assistant secretary at the Labor Department under George W. Bush. David also happens to be Reverend David Gray and serves as the pastor of the Bradley Hills Presbyterian Church. You know, when I graduated from divinity school, I thought I had to make a choice between working in policy or working in ministry, and David somehow successfully does both. So congratulations, David. We'll start with our co-chairs of the Poverty Forum, Reverend Wallis and Mike Gerson, who together will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then move to Mark and David for about 5 to 7 minutes of commentary each, leaving us plenty of time for discussion. The only thing I want to say is that the Poverty Forum, which was organized by Reverend Wallis and Mike Gerson, consists of 18 Christian leaders with expertise in poverty. And they drew from people working in research institutions, communities, faith-based organizations, government, and grassroots organizations. Their final report, released in February, had a range of proposals covering asset building, civil society, making work pay, family policy, and healthcare. I really applaud their efforts on the Poverty Forum. I applaud religious and non-religious efforts. They've done an amazing job in the Poverty Forum of bringing a lot of really diverse ideas and people together, and it gives us hope that we can really do something about poverty in this very unique, historic, and difficult moment in American life. Okay, we'll start there and turn it over to Reverend Wallis. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ray and the New America Foundation, and David and Mark. We're eager to hear from you and my friend Michael, co-chair of this project, and all of you who come in from the rain. It's 25 minutes between us, so you'll have plenty of chance to jump in the conversation here. We want to make this a dialogue. I think our ratings for this morning at C-SPAN got to be better than the Senate amendment debate I watched last night. When you're watching C-SPAN in bed, it's a serious issue. You know, your wife wants to watch the Queen hugging the First Lady, and you keep going back to amendment debates on C-SPAN with the budget. But these are serious issues. But I'm going to risk a joke to start, which makes a point that I think does pertain. There's a joke I used to tell about how there was this guy who was drowning in the Potomac about 100 feet offshore, and he's really in trouble. He's going down. The Republicans hear about his dilemma, rush down to the river, and he's 100 feet offshore. He's going down fast. They throw him 50 feet of rope, and they say, "The rest is up to you." The Democrats, hearing about this, they think they can do better. They rush down. He's now really in trouble, 100 feet offshore going down. They throw him 200 feet of rope and then let go of their end. It's a silly joke, but it makes a point that I think the poor have been stuck in the debate about poverty for a long time. And so we have to somehow see how our debates have really polarized and paralyzed our ability to do something. What's left and what's right, I think, is less important than what's right and what works actually on the ground. This forum came out with proposals that are very, if you will, secular. They're not religious principles. They're policy proposals that can be evaluated on their merits. But it is significant that all the people involved are indeed people of faith, and I think that's one of the reasons why this succeeded, because we weren't asking how this will affect the next midterm election. We're asking what will really benefit poor people, and for us, all of us, that was a matter of faith. It is indeed instructive to remember in this town that the way the prophets all agree, the way you evaluate a society is not by its gross national product, by its military firepower, or how its popular culture is the envy of the world. You evaluate a society always in a principle religious way, which is how it treats the weakest and most vulnerable in its midst. That's a tough evaluation for this town. It's tough for both parties, I would say, to really take that kind of criteria to evaluate social policy. So this was an effort. We didn't know Mark Rogers, who's here at Clapham, and Sojourners did this, had the conversation about a year ago, or actually 2 years we started talking about this. We didn't know if it'd work. It was a bold effort, but to see if we could actually, bipartisanship is a sort of a mantra now in this town, but we don't see a lot of examples of it really so far. But I think we were trying to say that fighting poverty ought to be one of those things that's a bipartisan commitment and a nonpartisan cause. We're not there yet, but I think we have some hope that that could be the future here. So what actually helps poor families? We drew people together who know policy, but also folks who really are on the ground, who work day after day with poor people. And they can tell you what's working and what's not in their neighborhoods that make a difference in people lifting themselves out of poverty. So we put the group together, and Michael will perhaps say more about this, and in about 7 areas, and I think the full report's out there. I won't go into the weeds here, though we can do that in the conversation. And we talked about things that I like to say were not sort of major comprehensive healthcare reform. Here's the blue blueprint, the big, the top stuff. We'll get to that. Nor was it as small and symbolic as school uniforms. It was sort of, you might say, deliberately middle-level stuff that was doable, that could actually be implemented and taken on by an administration or by a Congress. The areas were asset building. This is where you have a lot of passion here. Asset building, community factors, crime and reentry, family policy, health care, making work, and strengthening civil society. And Adam Taylor, our political director, just handed me these 7 areas where these already connect to the stimulus and the budget proposals. I'll just name them quickly. These are the 7 things that are already in the new conversation here. Create 2 million new opportunity housing vouchers. Connect disadvantaged and disconnected youth with school and work. Simplify and expand Pell Grants and make higher education accessible to residents of each state. Full funding for the Second Chance Act. Expansion of employment and training opportunities for ex-offenders. Funding for the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. And child tax credits. So we've had conversations with the Obama domestic policy team and others. We're talking with people on both sides of the aisle, Democrat, Republican. But this is based on, I think, a couple things. One is that relationships matter, that you have to talk to people and get to know people, and maybe even their motivations, why they're doing what they do. We put 2 people on each of these areas, and they were from both sides of the aisle, smart people and people of faith, and they produced we thought, some pretty good results. And the whole team did a kind of red light, green light, yellow light on these things, and we actually green lighted a whole series of things that we thought were very encouraging. So this is a beginning. We're going to do some things up ahead with the Congress and further, but I think it's the beginning of maybe the idea, which is still radical for this town, of a bigger tent kind of campaign on the issue of poverty. I've been talking with a number of people in this town, not just in the religious community, but in the folks who just did the good work on all of the Service Nation work. The bill just passed, and they're talking about moving from Service Nation to Opportunity Nation, to moving from service to poverty. That's a huge coalition. If they were to really take on poverty in a substantial way, that would be very effective. We talked about a multi-sector coalition on poverty, how all the sectors that we need somehow need to be involved. The kind of movements that inspire me as a evangelical revival preacher, the social reform movements, have always involved many sectors. But in all the successful reform movements, you had religion and faith and spirituality as part of it. It's always involved, generally, people of faith to be a catalytic motivator, kind of the moral authority for a movement is important to a social movement. And so this was an effort by people of faith to work at policy, which was their expertise, but their motivation was as people of faith. So it's a beginning. It's not perfect. We'll hear some critique, I hope, because we need some critique of our work. But it's a start, and I've especially enjoyed the relationship with Mark Rogers and Mike Gerson, who has served very effectively as co-chair of this whole effort. And he and I have we've had some lunches and conversations, and I think it shows that people on different sides of the aisle can find common ground, can enjoy working together, and even can find that they like each other. So I'll turn things over to my co-chair, Mike Gerson.
Thank you, Jim. That's much appreciated. It's good to be at the New American Foundation, to be with these distinguished panelists, and especially to be with Jim once again. Some people have viewed our cooperation as an exercise in bipartisanship in a time when it's rare. Others have seen it as evidence in the group of the confluence of evangelical and Catholic teaching on social justice. Still others, less impressed, have seen it as a sign of the impending apocalypse. And it's caused a lively debate on whether it is Jim or myself who is the whore of Babylon. But my interest in this issue is personal and long-standing. Periodically, in our modern history, terrible events reveal the existence of durable intergenerational poverty in our midst. The LA riots or Katrina. But attention spans are short. Outrage flashes and then fades. The country moves on, but it does little to change. I saw this in the context of Katrina. Scandal in that crisis was not merely the initial response, but the storm, money eventually flowed in large amounts to the region. But the storm had revealed something larger than bad levees. The Bush administration attempted to deliver benefits to many people who had never had a bank account, people entirely disconnected from the mainstream of the American economy, people essentially living in a different country. But America's political class, in the aftermath of Katrina, failed just as surely as those levees. Republicans were mainly interested in budget offsets. Democrats were mainly interested in the apportionment of blame. Few wanted to confront the vast, complex challenge before our eyes. Part of America without assets, without economic mobility, and without the realistic hope of progress. Our current recession is another chance to address these issues. And a number of practical and positive measures have been taken, including the expansion of food stamps, EITC. But the people hurt most at home and abroad in a recession are sometimes less visible. That's the paradox of a recession. Our discourse focuses almost entirely on middle-income Americans. In the president's really excellent first speech to Congress, there was hardly a word about the poor. We are seeing what might be called a preferential option for the middle class. I come from a conservative perspective on these issues. I do not believe that a leveling equality is a fair or effective goal of government. Inequality is a natural, inescapable consequence of economic freedom. But for inequality to be morally justified, it must be accompanied by economic mobility. Inequality without mobility is a caste system, an economic aristocracy. As you know, there are disturbing signs found in the Economic Mobility Project of the Pew Foundation, which is really a very important document. The ends of the American income scale are sticky. The wealthy tend to remain wealthy, the poor tend to remain poor. America ends up having less economic mobility than Canada or Finland or Denmark, and has really not increased since the 1980s. There are many reasons for this, from family structures to globalization and manufacturing, and a lot of different reasons for this. But there's much at stake in these issues, in individual lives, and in the definition of the American ideal. The Poverty Forum was a response to this challenge, and an interesting experiment. What could faith-oriented policy experts of varied backgrounds agree on? And several themes emerged. First, there is a strong commitment to trusting and strengthening civil society in these proposals. The common ground of community organizers and compassionate conservatives. Many of these ideas are clearly influenced by the Catholic idea of subsidiarity, the defense of the local, the trusted, often faith-based institutions as well as families. These act as a limit on government's reach and an antidote to radical individualism, atomism, isolation. Second, there is a major emphasis on asset building, a recognition that the wealth gap in America is far greater than the earnings gap and a key element of generational mobility. And third, the policies that emerge take seriously some of the really urgent, pressing needs of minority communities, particularly AIDS and problems raised by the massive incarceration rates in our country and reentry back into society. And fourth, many of the proposals focus on making work, easing the struggle of working families, pushing towards a tax system that is both pro-work and pro-family. These proposals were not intended, as Jim said, to be comprehensive, not a 10-year package to eliminate poverty in America. The direction that we gave participants was different. Come up with medium-sized proposals that would advance the debate on poverty in the executive branch and on Capitol Hill. And these, coming from a policy background in government, are exactly the type of proposals that are useful in advocating within an administration or within a congressional office. But the effort has been motivated by an ambitious vision rooted in faith. In long Christian reflection on these issues, a certain definition of justice has emerged. The justice of a society is not merely the impartial application of rules, the rule of law, free markets, and open societies. The justice of a society is also determined by its treatment of the weak, the suffering, the struggling, the powerless, the voiceless. And so the largest purpose of this effort is summarized in the Anglican liturgy. Let not the needy be forgotten, nor the hope of the poor be taken away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the New America Foundation and particularly to thank Ray for that very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here today and would like to thank Reverend Wallis and Mike Gerson and their colleagues for the efforts and the work of the Poverty Forum. I want to begin, I'll have some specific comments as I go, but I want to begin by truly commending the Poverty Forum both for taking on the specific issue and for the way in which they've approached the work that they've done. As has already been alluded to, it is often really difficult to have constructive bipartisan or nonpartisan conversations around here. They often very quickly devolve to charges and countercharges and scoring points. And I think it is terrifically important that people who have shared concerns come together, talk through those concerns, identify where they can agree, and identify where they can't agree, and recognize good faith on both sides, and seek to advance the process of moving forward. So I think that's important as a general rule. I particularly want to commend the emphasis on poverty. Ray offered a set of fairly compelling statistics at the beginning that as we went into the recession, it was 1 out of 8 people in the United States living in poverty under a, in my view, profoundly deficient definition of what constitutes poverty. A far larger number of the American people struggling to get by and meet basic needs. This was before the recession, with today's unemployment figures, the number of unemployed having grown by 5 million in this past year. And we are, if unemployment continues to grow in the ways in which it appears to be, we are looking at the highest poverty rates in the United States in a very long time. And that's significantly understating the magnitude of the problem. So in this context, on the one hand, in my view, it is absolutely appropriate that policymakers emphasize that this is a time of profound economic insecurity, not just affecting the poor, but affecting a much larger group of the American people. At the same time, I also think it's particularly important that the conversation not just be one about the middle class. and that there be an expressed recognition of both the conditions that were in place before the downturn happened, and then what the recession has meant for and will mean for people across the country. So I commend the fact that they have come together and sought to elevate a conversation about poverty in this time. I hope that the people that they are able to reach out to will extend far beyond the 18 of them, and that ultimately one of the things which I think is quite important here is the recognition that there can be a broad agreement we want to reduce poverty, and it's okay to disagree about how to get there, that part of what we should be having is an explicit national debate about what are the approaches that will most effectively get us there. So on the one hand, I very much appreciate the decision to focus on the middle ground kinds of proposals here. At the same time, if we want to truly and substantially reduce poverty in the United States, we'll need to go beyond the middle ground proposals or the middle level proposals and go further. And so I actually hope that their effort and efforts like it promote discussion about ways to do that. I do want to highlight that as I looked at the proposals, first, it's not entirely clear which ones everybody agreed on and which ones are ones where people just said, we think this is something that's worth discussing. And it's good to know that people think it's worth discussing, but it's better to know what people actually agree on. I also think that as I looked at the set of proposals, in some instances it seemed clear that they were ones that both sides heartily agreed on and thought was absolutely the right thing to do. In other instances, they struck me that they were probably compromises in nature, where one side wanted to go much further than the other, and people were prepared to say, we agree to do at least this. I actually think for purposes of the policy process, in those situations, it's better to say, here's where we agree and here's where we disagree. That we all think that the minimum wage ought to be increased, but some of us think it ought to be raised a lot, and some of us think it ought to be raised a little. All of us in this group believe there ought to be an expansion of the earned income tax credit, but some of us would go much further than others in doing so. Because I do think one of the challenges in seeking to proceed in a way such as this is that sometimes the result that is compromise may be necessary because it's compromise, but we shouldn't necessarily treat compromise as principle. The place where people can find common ground isn't necessarily the best policy, it's just the place where they can find common ground. So having noted all that, let me just highlight, and again, I appreciate that there was a decision made to focus on the middle level, and I also appreciate that the world has been sort of changing beneath our feet as this process has been going on. At the same time, I would note that particularly as you look ahead to perhaps your next chapter in this effort, one of the central drivers of poverty in a recession is unemployment. The nation's unemployment system does a poor job of assisting low-wage workers. There are actually some important provisions in the recovery package that would make, if states adopt them, would make significant headway in expanding coverage of low-wage workers. And I hope that there can be shared agreement on the importance of an unemployment system that reaches low-wage workers. I also, and this may have not been here because it wasn't one of the middle ground things, but next year we will be facing a debate about welfare reform once again. The welfare law comes up for reauthorization. There were some notable successes in the early years after the 1996 welfare law. It was a very mixed story in that time, but what's particularly striking now is that the share of poor children who are receiving assistance through that system has essentially collapsed. It used to be more than 60%. It's now down about a third or less. The share of eligible families getting help has plummeted in a very dramatic way over these 12 years. So this is an area where, in my view, the debate has been particularly poisonous, where it has been extremely hard to find common ground, where if we don't, if there can't be agreement about where to go around the rules of the welfare system, there is a need to recognize that there is an enormous gap in our national safety net for low-income families with children when they are without work and don't qualify for unemployment insurance. And I very much hope that there can be some common ground in an effort to address that. I, of course, have more to say, but I'll hold off the rest for the comments. Thanks.
Well, good morning, and thank you for you all for being here to discuss these alliances, challenges, and new ideas to combat poverty. On the alliance front, I'd like to as well commend Jim and Mike for putting together with their colleagues the Poverty Forum. I think it's extremely powerful to have these concepts and the common ground that they've forged behind them. But I also think there is some flexibility to be able to go to the policymakers with a broad number of issues that are comprehensive and thorough, and that the next challenge might well be to pick which ones to make the highest point of emphasis, perhaps those where there is indeed a firm area of consensus by the greatest number of members of the forum. In order to have the most effective outcome, there may be some need to focus one's advocacy efforts. But the alliance that has been forged by Mike and Jim and colleagues is very powerful. I think more broadly within the faith community, the congregation I serve, Montgomery County, working with the business community, I think the new alliances around helping the most vulnerable that are coming to light as a result, frankly, of the times of the recession are very powerful. And these two leaders are at the forefront. The challenges of this time in the recession bring a couple issues to my mind that are both included, but I think could be highlighted more in the Poverty Forum's proposals. The first is the area of particular emphasis of poverty on children. In this room on June 3rd, we're going to release our Child Wellbeing Index for this year, for instance, and show a decline for the first time in a number of years driven by the decline in family income. The impact of children in poverty as a result of the recession and a result of years of inadequate attention, I think, is particularly acute. And while the Making Work section of the forum's emphasis has a number of tax proposals to help children, I think more can be done in this area to emphasize this most vulnerable group. I think particularly as families lose health insurance, children become more reliant on state programs, Medicaid, SCHIP, where there are strained budgets, decreased access to child care, and frankly just the emotional impact of family stress or having your home foreclosed hits children particularly hard. Young adults are an area I'm particularly interested in as well. With older workers needing more workplace attachment rather than retiring, you're going to have younger workers, those just trying to get into the workforce, being crowded out. And frankly, some of the problems we used to see for teenagers are now migrating into the young adult populations in terms of teen pregnancy and drug and alcohol use and violence. So I think a particular attention societal-wise to poor young adults, those who, after they've passed 18 and don't have any of the kinds of support they had previously, are of particular need if we want to focus on most vulnerable poor families. I'm very glad that the forum focused on the need for parenting, fatherhood, and families. I think the recessions, if we look historically, have tended to hit single families as opposed to families with two parents particularly hard. And so an emphasis to try to deal with the particular challenges of single parenting is in order. And I also wanted to raise in the idea of beyond allowances and challenges of new ideas, the area of the flexibility of the workforce, workplace flexibility, and the structure of work. Because I think that one area of real need when we think about new ideas that are just emerging but aren't getting appropriate emphasis is how the structure of work really impedes the mobility of poor families. Mike talked about the promise of mobility. But I think in particular, for instance, hourly workers have a particular need for help. Poor workers and hourly workers often don't have the same kind of powerful support that TANF or Unemployment Insurance, Family and Medical Leave Act, where things are dependent on the number of hours worked, and so many hourly workers don't benefit sufficiently. And we know that many of these safety net programs, which will depend on income and some shifting schedules that many of these workers have to deal with impede their ability to be supported by some of these safety net programs. We know that poor workers are the most likely to need flexibility in their days for child care and medical appointments, but the least likely to have access to it. And the flexibility that families in poverty could benefit from in terms of the scheduling for work and the support for work and family balance in our society, I believe, are inefficient. So I would uphold the ideas of just as a new idea piece, trying to improve the safety net in terms of the support for families to be able to balance their lives, and with a particular emphasis on low-income and hourly workers. There's been a lot of discussion in Washington on a bipartisan level about how we provide more flexibility in the structure of work for low-income families. Predictability in the number of hours worked, when work is scheduled, advance notification of hours, control of schedules would make a particular difference for poor families. Transportation, childcare, a lack of access to control over lives, which come quickly out of balance, more quickly for poor families than for middle class or professional families, can throw an entire family's work attachment off if one thing goes out of balance. As a child is acutely sick, it throws the whole work attachment off. So I agree with the analysis that jobs and employment are critical. In order to provide that, and when we think about new ideas, a broader structure on how we make the workplace more flexible and provide some family supports are critical. The new alliances and the new challenges of this time, as Michael said, highlights, as Katrina did, the need for helping poor families. I want to again applaud these two leaders both for many years of work, but in particular for coming together to highlight these, both the population and the hope that something can be done to help them. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were great presentations and great commentary. I'd like to give Reverend Wallis and Mike Gerson an opportunity to respond to the comments first before we open it up for questions, if you'd like to say anything.
My immediate reaction was that I wish both these very capable men had been in some of our discussions. It was the emphasis, particularly as we're seeing the acceleration of the recession on child poverty, on an unemployment system designed decades ago that doesn't work particularly well. Those, I think, have come to the fore, and they're very good suggestions. I think we do have the reauthorization, and you would know better, of child nutrition programs coming up. I think food stamps is a very effective way to meet some of these needs, a program that has been reformed over the last few years. It's much better than it used to be. That also delivers stimulus spending pretty efficiently. And so some of that's been done. And so, we're now looking at the strains and looking at the gaps, and those seem to be very important gaps. There are, I would only, before I turn it to Jim, say that there is, I think, valid debate on both sides between ambition and consensus. Okay, we wanted to our main goal here was to prove among a fairly diverse group of people that at least a level of consensus was possible. The consensus that was reached was actually in the groups themselves. So the person doing asset formation, one person from one side, one person from the other, they agreed. The general group, did kind of yellow-lighted, green-lighted, and red-lighted proposals. I would say overwhelmingly these were green-lighted proposals, but there were a couple of instances where, because we drew from genuine conservatives in this, not just objections on minimum wage and some of these other issues. But I guess the response just to the very valid question was that these proposals were overwhelmingly approved, but not universally approved, but they were unanimously approved within the working groups. Okay, which I think means something. These are some of the leading experts of left and right from a religious kind of faith perspective on these issues. The only other thing that I would say, just as far as regrets are concerned with Ray, and the importance sometimes of how these personal relationships and coalitions work is that at one point we were tantalizingly close, weeks from getting a child-safe proposal in one of George W. Bush's State of the Union addresses. And it was, there were good people who pushed within the system, and but there was serious resistance from the National Economic Council and other more libertarian influences within the party. And so it does matter to begin to build a broader and grassroots constituency around these ideas at key moments. When something like that is considered, I have always viewed that as maybe one of the most revolutionary long-term changes that could be pursued of any of the policies that are here. I mean, we have a tremendous wealth gap in America, that has a lot of reasons, but some of them include what Lincoln called, generations of unrequited toil and how we respond to this. And it's a positive common ground way to build wealth over time, which is, that you can borrow against, and it's important to entrepreneurship and ownership and a lot of other things. And so what I found is that key insiders pushing things can be important, but it is also important to start to build outside coalitions at key moments that can weigh in to policy processes, which can be messy, last minute, and require outside pressure. And so that I think is one of the useful things about starting to identify some common ground proposals, is that you can start to build coalitions around them.
I would echo what Mike said about David and Mark's. In fact, I think you've given us the agenda for the next step. Next steps, I just took those down very carefully. A couple things to put in context. We decided to do this really last summer, before we knew who would be the president, before we had any idea, assuming it could be either party's nominee, and before the economy collapsed. So the context was, let's find some things that could be clear and positive and substantial that could theoretically be adopted by a president of either party without the context of the recession. Well, I think the context, as you say, Ray, the world has changed around us here. You all pointed that out, and I think we have, in fact, more pain than we had imagined, but also perhaps more opportunity. I want to particularly lift up what Mark said about the need to have an explicit conversation in this country about poverty, and not to sort of mask our concerns with let's lift up the middle class. I like Mike's preferential option for the middle class, which is a really habit of both parties. The President's Advisory Council, which I am one of its members, has 4 priorities, and the first of which is to make poverty reduction a central part of the economic recovery. And that's the task force that I'm going to help to lead. And to be frank, we've had some conversations about the need for this administration to, in our view, be more explicit about the word poverty and the focus on poverty. And I love Mark's idea of a serious national debate about what works, what really is most effective. We've learned some things. There were some things we've tried that we thought would help, and it didn't help. It made some things worse, let's be honest. And some things that we've given mantras, oh, just try this, and that'll do it by itself. The invisible hand will make everything work. The invisible hand sometimes lets go of the common good, and that's where Catholic social teaching comes in. So I think there's a real chance here to go further, particularly on minimum wage issues and some of the employment things. There was not as much consensus, but there was, I think Mike would agree with me, that the focus on work was very common. And what Mark was saying about work, unemployment being central, I think really both sides see work, making work, increasing mobility, making work pay, support. I come from Detroit, and I grew up in a time when all of our dads came back from World War II, and they all had jobs at Ford and Chrysler and GM, and mine at Detroit Edison. Jobs that paid for a family's life. And they all had 3-bedroom FHA houses in the same neighborhood. And we all went to the same churches. And my dad was in management, and he was often called in to negotiate labor contracts because he was a cooperative kind of guy who thought unions were needed, even though he didn't always agree with them. But lower middle class, and upper middle class folks were in the same neighborhood and went to the same churches. And there was a sense of there being a social contract. And if you wanted a job at Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and you were the son of an employee, you thought you could go get one. And my dad got lots of jobs for lots of people in our church. Those days are over. We can't go back to the economic circumstances there, but what about talking about what a new social contract would look like in our time and place? And I think it's about employment, unemployment, and it's about, both Mike and I believe there ought to be a safety net that protects the dignity of people who can't work. And Mark Rogers, as I said before, we began this conversation really around welfare reform, TANF reform last time. We had a dialogue among Senate top staffers who were from the Finance Committee writing that bill, Democrat, Republican. And I remember some of them said to me during those discussions, we met every week during that period. And I said, why do you come and meet all the time? You're so busy. You could say my boss has called me and I got to vote. And he said, well, it's one of the few places that's still bipartisan up on this hill. We can actually talk together about what we're thinking. Two, we're actually civil here. We don't interrupt each other. We're afraid to misbehave in front of religious leaders. And three, it helps this meeting. It helps us remember why we came here, what the values were that drew us here in the first place, that we can forget in a place like this. Now, that committee actually wrote a pretty good TANF reform bill, and it got sabotaged by the House, basically. So I think there's real opportunity here, but we're going to have to, I think, respond now to a bigger crisis, a bigger picture, and I think perhaps because of that, some new opportunities.
Thank you. Very, very thoughtful. Just a very brief comment, if I may, with regards to what Mike Gerson said about the children's accounts coming this close. I read that in your book. I had worked with you at that time, and it was a very disappointing moment. But commend you enormously for that fight. What's interesting about that proposal is that, as the Pew research shows, people, in the data, the apple really does fall to the tree, especially on the low end and the high end. And you tend to inherit opportunity or lack of opportunity from your parents. And like you, I'm not a big fan of equality of outcomes, but I very much believe in equality of opportunity. The problem is, especially with wealth, inequality of outcomes in one generation becomes inequality of opportunity in the next. How do you break that? How do you ensure that every generation has a fresh opportunity, a fresh chance for opportunity? And that's what we think the brilliance of the Kids Accounts proposal is. The other thing that was amazing about the Pew study that Mike referenced is that, and this actually was taken in January when the recession had started and was well underway, 80% of Americans actually believed that it was still possible to achieve the American dream. And remarkably, that cut across racial, ethnic, and income lines. Even the very poorest people, the ones who the data suggest have no reason to believe, still persisted. I was very heartened by that finding. And just a final comment on Jim. I couldn't agree more about the need to rethink the fundamentals. If this is a once-in-a-century opportunity to rethink the social contract, how we structure the society, how we grow the economy, And we have a next social contract initiative here at the New America Foundation looking at some of these fundamental questions. And for those of you who care, I happen, with Phil Longman, have a book coming out, and it's out already, but on April 14th we have a book coming out called The Next Progressive Era, where we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I wouldn't normally mention something like that, except that my publisher happens to be in the room today. And so I thought I should say something, but please come on April 14th and we'll talk about that then. Let me open it up to the audience, and please, it's important that you state your name and your affiliation. And I don't know if we're going to have mics going around the room. We do, and it's important to use those as well, because, again, C-SPAN is covering this event live. So, questions? Yes, in the back? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm Maryann Stein, the president of the Mariah Fund, which is a private foundation that's been funding in poverty areas. Mark is well aware of us. And I was particularly struck, Mr. Gerson, by your comment that you wish that these two gentlemen had been in some of your meetings. And I would like to suggest, not knowing what your process was, but maybe in addition to bringing the Democrats and the Republicans together, bringing in some of the organizations in this city, in New York, wherever they are, many of them are here, into some of these conversations. I was just in a meeting of the Grantmakers Income Security Task Force earlier this week, and the panels there touched on a number of these issues, talking about particularly a lot of the work issues and what impacts the ability of low-income people to maintain, to gain and maintain an attachment to the workforce. And they're really much greater than initially meets the eye. And I would offer certainly the resources of the Grantmakers Income Security Task Force in terms of some of the entities who have some pretty long-standing experience in working on some of these issues, in meeting with you and connecting you with some of the organizations who do have some information. Among other things, there are gender issues. Women have specific issues, mothers in particular, in terms of their participation in the workforce and what their needs are. And in terms of the kinds of jobs and the conditions of those jobs that often make it very difficult for them and are responsible for a large percentage of the children of single mothers being in poverty. So I think it's really commendable that you have initiated this, and I wish you all the success in the world and offer our assistance in any way we can make it.
Yeah. One response to that, first of all, much appreciated. If we erred in this process, we erred on the side of nimbleness, because sometimes it's very easy to have very large processes. And we chose in each of these areas a single person who was a leading policy expert, many from Capitol Hill, or practitioners, many out in the field, and just ask the question, open-ended question, very non-directive question, what can you agree on? It was kind of an experiment. But it makes perfect sense now that having come up with our list and launched our effort to try to be more inclusive in that process, and to determine what some of the gaps, which clearly I think have been effectively outlined, as we move forward, but also begin to consult on some of these issues with people that have been at this a long time. But I guess my only response would be that we this was almost like a controlled social science experiment. It was not an attempt to survey every field and kind of talk with every expert and come up with a consensus set of proposals. It was really taking some of the smartest people we knew, okay, that had come from a faith perspective. Because both Jim and I believe that brings maybe something different and interesting to this debate, and asking them what can you agree on. But I agree with you. I think the next stages are to go beyond that.
In fact, we should talk afterwards.
Right. Yeah.
Because indeed, this was a pilot project. And as I say, the context was important. We didn't know who'd win the election, and we didn't know the economy would collapse. So I think now it actually, I would say, it went better than I thought it would. we had these green light sessions, and we didn't know until we had them whether we'd get very far. You know, what Mark was saying, how much I thought there could be maybe pretty narrow agreements and broad disagreements, and then we wouldn't have much to show for all the work. So it went better than we thought. The context is very different now. There's more opportunity now. So I think the big tent kind of thing that I think, and I'm aware of your task force, I think that kind of group could be essential to the success of this. Absolutely.
Of course.
We have a lot of hands. Kathy, then here, and then there, and then Steve. Okay, behind you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Saley with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and with the Poverty Forum. And I want to thank Mike and Jim very much for the honor and privilege of working with all of you, and I look forward to it in the future. It was a great experience. And my question is around this. I agree very much that we have, in the campaign, we heard a lot of rhetoric about the middle class, to the point where you thought maybe Matthew 25 was, whatever you do to the least of the middle class, you've done unto me. And a lot of that, if you talk to the more progressive liberal consultants, is, well, we can't really talk about the poor. It doesn't poll well. And I think the conservatives also misuse a lot of regressive tax policy proposals couched as protecting the middle class. How do we build that support and political will and capacity in our country to care for the poor and to be able to talk freely and openly about the reality of poverty in our country? I'd like to hear from all of you, but Mike, you raised it a little bit of how we build that grassroots movement.
I think it's difficult. I mean, I have a background in rhetoric, and the discourse on this issue has been very constrained. Social justice language has not been popular among Democrats or Republicans. And I will give you a true fact that no one will believe, but during two presidential campaigns in 2000 and 2004, the Republican candidate talked more about addiction, poverty, and those kind of issues than the Democratic candidate did. Because, the president talked about compassionate conservatism and faith-based institutions and all these sort of things. Now, you may not think that's sufficient or even wise, but it was more part of that dialogue than it was on the Democratic side. So I think there's a real challenge there. But I would say that one of the hopeful things that has come out of this process is the fact that evangelicalism, which is the religious background Jim and I kind of come out of, is really searching for a model of social engagement, a way to talk about these issues beyond the religious rite. Okay? And it's led to a lot of interesting and increasing ties, which the Poverty Forum represented, with Catholic social thought, and talk about subsidiarity and solidarity and other influences. That's pretty new to a lot of people. And so, from a language perspective, one of the things is to start to develop a language of the common good spoken by people that are people of faith in the political process that, it can, encourage political leaders to do the same. I hope there is a large constituency eventually in this country among Catholics and evangelicals that is pro-life and pro-poor. Okay, I think that would help to change our debate in many ways. And it's that's one of the opportunities that that I hope we're trying to advance here, not just to pick some good policy ideas and talk about them, but to say that people from a faith perspective, and broader than a faith perspective, can bring a developed model of social engagement here that says we have to be concerned about everyone, we have to be concerned about the common good, we have to respect community and faith-based institutions, but we're not individualists, and we're not sink and swim, and we're not social Darwinists, and we believe in markets, and we believe in families, and we believe in responsibility, and we believe in the safety net. And there has to be some discourse around that supports politicians who will make those same arguments. And there, to be honest, there hasn't been much. I think the reality is there's more than there used to be, and there's a real kind of searching going on.
I want to underscore the question and ask it of Mark, because this is a conversation that I think Mark and I both have had on the progressive side. I have a lot of people who are my allies on the liberal progressive side who don't want to use the language of poverty in poor people. I mean, it's a pretty big argument they make, and they want to say, it's finally about self-interest, and you've got to tell people that they're going to be middle class someday, and so we're all for the middle class, and basically it's a middle class project to make the middle class bigger. But I think I've had plenty of battles with the right of not talking about justice and poverty, but I've had those battles too on the left. And so, Mark, you're making a point about making this more explicit, and I'd like to hear how you think that could be done even on the progressive side.
Sure, and thank you. As Ray indicated in the introduction, one thing I've done in the last several years is I had been the executive director of a task force on poverty for the Center for American Progress. And in our first meeting, we actually had an extended discussion about should this be called a task force on poverty and should we be using the word poverty. And one of the people said, and ultimately the group agreed, it's really hard to make progress in addressing a problem if you're not willing to talk about it. And I do think that substantively, and I'll talk about the communications aspect in a moment, that there are pieces of advancing on addressing poverty that can be done in the context of broader, more universal efforts. And policy decisions that are made about where we go on healthcare, where we go on energy policy, on education, other aspects of that, by ensuring that they are structured in an inclusive way and in a way that's purposive about also addressing the needs of low-income people, they can make a really big difference. At the same time, there are significant aspects of what need to happen, in my view, in reducing poverty that ultimately really aren't just about the middle class, really do call for having an explicit focus on areas of concentrated poverty, on extreme poverty, on people with serious barriers to employment who have difficulty entering or sustaining participation in the workforce, and on all of the aspects of low-wage work that mean that when you're in a low-wage job, in a lot of ways, you don't have things that other people take for granted as part of their jobs. So it ultimately, I think, does call for it being both an economic security middle-class discussion and one that explicitly contains a goal around poverty reduction. I will say, in terms of not just the message, but even how we think about it, that a piece of this, in my view, is the moral and the faith-based argument for why poverty is wrong, why it is wrong that so many Americans and people around the world are living in such circumstances. There is also an economic argument, and the moral argument and the economic argument push in the same direction. We saw some of the economic argument actually in the context of the stimulus, where people were saying, if we provide greater resources to low-income communities, they'll spend more. There's a multiplier effect, and so forth. That'll do more to help the economy going. But there's a much deeper economic argument. One of the things that we also did in our task force was we commissioned some work from some economists and asked them to look at the question of what's the drag on the U.S. economy as a result of persistent poverty and of children growing up in persistent poverty. Because when children do, and when we have constricted social mobility, it's not just hurting them, it's hurting all of us, because the nation loses that potential when that happens. So they looked across, for children growing up in persistent poverty, what are the adult costs in terms of unemployment, crime, health care, while emphasizing most poor children don't grow up to be people who commit crime, concluded at the time that it was around $500 billion a year.
That was a bigger figure a few years ago than it seems to be now. But, you know, but it underscores that there is a significant drag on the U.S. economy. And I think as we now have this conversation about how do we rebuild the economy, it's right, in my view, that a part of it is about what do we do around healthcare and energy and education, but it's also recognizing that building a new opportunity structure where we are not squandering the resources of so many of our people is fundamental to the nation's economic growth and competitiveness.
You know, I really agree with that, and just to say one quick word about it, including low-income people in all that we do is critical, and there's an argument for that. There's an economic argument to be made for this, but I think the retention of the moral argument in the conversation is very important. I want to say it's not just a religious domain, and here Mike and I both said that we were people of faith was important here. This is not going to be limited, this movement, to people of faith, but I do think we have to retain the moral argument. Because finally, what I started with this morning, I do think a society is best morally evaluated, in the end, by how it treats the weakest and most vulnerable members of a society. And if you lose that to just expanding the middle class, you've lost something fundamental to the ethic, the fabric, the decency of a society. And I must say, even though I pushed the Obama team to be a bit more explicit on poverty, I was on a White House conference call right after the budget came out because I was a member of the Faith Advisory Council. And I heard members of this administration go through agency by agency in this budget of what the benefit to low-income people was in this budget. On the call were veteran poverty activists from all over the country, and here were policy people with the explicit focus of the entire phone call. How does this budget impact low-income families and vulnerable people? I have never been in a government conversation about that before in my life. It was a policy wonkish talk, deep in the weeds. You had to know policy to even know what the call was about. And yet I was sitting there alone in a conference room, hearing things that I've been arrested for in a budget and in a government call talking about the benefit to low-income people of this and this and this. And I was in tears. So I would say, let's make it a little less stealth and a little more explicit, but I really want to affirm the fact of a low-income people, family focus being good for the economy, for mobility, for inclusion, but also it helps make us, the fabric of our society and culture, much more moral.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Reverend Wallis.
Your name, please, name and affiliation.
Yes, Ginny Thornburg from the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition.
Wow.
And David Saperstein has already told you about our work. I want to give you two new facts which haven't been introduced today. 54 million Americans have a legally defined disability. That's according to the 2000 census. Disability can be physical, can be sensory, psychiatric, or intellectual. 54 million of us have a disability. And within those of us who live in poverty, 24% have disability. So for you who are so properly and eloquently focused on poverty, I urge you to think very specifically about the disability community. That has a good organization, has a lot of powerful speakers and facts, and you particularly, Jim Wallis, who cares so deeply, I urge you to remember our folks, children and adults.
Thank you. I believe in the back, and then here, and then Steve. Yes.
Hi. This actually is a question. But
Your name and
Oh,
affiliation.
sorry. Iris Portney. And though I do not formally represent them, I'm active in my congregation, Reformed Jewish congregation in Virginia, Temple Road of Shalom. And we are a congregation among many Reformed congregations nationally that are involved in the Just Congregations movement, which maybe you are aware of or not. And my question to you is, since the program is about alliances and efforts to incorporate ethics and faith and programs, why was there not more of an involvement at the outset in terms of interfaith discussions? I didn't hear that. I read the information. I saw who was on the Poverty Forum panel. And if not, are you thinking about that as a next step? Because because Just Congregations is all about interfaith outreach, and it seems like that would be a natural alliance.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and David Saperstein, who's over at RAC, David's my rabbi, and we work on poverty questions all the time. He's also on the Obama Advisory Faith Council. Again, this project was something that was a very limited, focused in scope. It was not just one person per issue, but it was also just people we were talking about in the Christian community, because we didn't want it to be about a whole lot of other issues too. But the movement we're talking about has to be interfaith. I'm aware of the Just Congregation movement. It's a very powerful one. This must be not only interfaith, but I would say beyond faith in this country. It can't just be people of faith. And so as we go forward, I think the broader agenda, the deeper agenda, the crisis agenda is certainly on our minds, and also how to make it more interfaith is certainly, I'm already in conversation with a number of rabbis about how to make that happen. So thank you for that.
How many
Imams
more?
too, imams and rabbis.
Can I get all the hands, folks who want to? Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take the questions and the comments in sequence, and then give the speakers each a chance to respond. That way everybody has a chance to say something. So first, second, okay, 4, 5. So briefly, name and affiliation in your question or comment, and then we'll just move through, and then I'll turn to the speakers.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I now am a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, so you would wonder why I'm here. I started life at the Peace Corps. I was also in the poverty program when it got started. I think respect is an enormously important thing. And I think I now work on energy. It's all, from my perspective, it's all based on how people think, feel, and behave. So I look at behavior. And one of the issues that I watch in people at the lower end is often they don't have the right skill sets in getting along when they get into a job, so they run into trouble. I just want to tell you that there is a tiny school up in Norwich, Vermont, which teaches kids, kindergartens through 3rd grade, all in the same class, how to resolve problems. It's called Recess Chat, and it is managed by one of the children, and I saw it 2 weeks ago, managed by a 1st grader. And they have figured out how to deal with conflict. At this particular session, the little boy who'd caused it personally apologized to every child he had offended, and all I thought was, grown-ups need to learn how to do this. So I'm suggesting, anyway, I think there's this whole educational thing you have to do early on. This is long-term. This doesn't produce the kind of immediate financial things you're talking about. But by the way, if we started creating...
Do you have a question or...
Well, the question is, how would you get the classes to basically get into one-room classes, which this was? You could hire many more of these young kids and transform education as well as the poverty program.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Okay, let's keep moving through. Just as you see the hands, Mark, if you can grab them. Thanks.
I'm Stephen Schafferman with IncomeSecurityForAll.org, the Income Security Institute. And I want to ask people on the panel and inform everyone, it was a bipartisan, moderate idea in the 1960s that there ought to be some type of guaranteed income. Richard Nixon's guaranteed income plan passed with 2/3 of the vote in the House, but was narrowly blocked in the Senate. Was widely supported by the religious community. Martin Luther King campaigned for the idea. And on the far right, Milton Friedman talked about the negative income tax. As I talk about these ideas among policy people and the general public here in DC and elsewhere, I actually find more engagement and interest from conservatives and libertarians who see this, following Friedman's argument, see this as a way to cut government programs, and, as Jim Wallis said, a lot of hesitance from liberal Democrats to talk about anything so bold. So I want to ask people on the panel and others if you see an opening for a really bold idea that could then create more space for what you're proposing behind it. Thank you.
Al Milliken, AM Media. In the past of Barack Obama, particularly in his role as a community organizer, what more have you learned about his ideas and action that give you encouragement? And didn't George W. Bush's historical struggle with alcohol specifically add a critical personal dimension to his approach to faith-based groups?
Jody Levin-Epstein with the Center for Law and Social Policy, and I also help manage the project Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, www.spotlightonpoverty.org.
It's a great site. It's
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you very much, Ray.
Yes.
Kudos to the Poverty Forum, and thank you very much. You've accomplished a great deal just by coming together and proving a big tent is possible, and that is what Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity is all about as well. One of the challenges, if we are all about creating an attitude across the nation that poverty is to be tackled and it is not acceptable to have the levels of poverty that this nation has, is to believe that poverty exists. There is an ideology in the nation that also persists that says the poor in the U.S. are not poor. After all, they have air conditioners on occasion and color television sets as well. I would ask for you to advise us on how your forum has addressed that issue and how, as well as we've talked a lot about grassroots movements and state level efforts as well, how folks at the ground level can address that pushback. Thank you.
Hello, Stu Cohen from AARP Foundation, and just an aside, in terms of poverty, let's not forget our older members as well. I was struck, though, in looking through your materials, when you're talking about asset building, there's nothing that I saw mentioned really about depletion of assets. The predatory mortgage lenders, the payday lenders, the auto title pawn brokers. It would seem to me organizations like yours could engage in an evangelical war against the money chargers. And people's, whatever limited savings or assets they have are being wiped away dramatically by those kinds of charges of 400 to 1,000% annual interest rates.
Okay, last comment, question?
Hillary Dallin, National Council on Aging, and I just wanted to follow on what Stu just said and remind everybody, especially the folks up in the front of the room, that close to 40% of people on Medicare, which is to say close to 40% of 45 million older people and adults with disabilities are living in poverty. And so while this is a very exciting forum and lots of compelling ideas have been discussed, I would also like to ask that you very carefully consider the needs of older people and adults living with disabilities who are coping with poverty, have been for a long time, and the current economic crisis is hitting them so hard. They have to be a part of your discussion, and we look forward to hearing more about that from you. Thank you.
Briefly, sir? Yes.
Gordon Kavanaugh, I'm the DC Housing Authority.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Here we are.
Gordon Kavanaugh, I'm on the DC Housing Authority Board, and I've been in public housing, either running it or representing the major housing authorities in this country for 35 years, which I would characterize somewhat as the 35-year war. We always had to struggle against, I would say, primarily Republican majorities, and we've been somewhat starved by presidential budgets throughout that period. But in Sondheim's word, we're still here. But it's been a terrible effort against the more conservative forces in this country, with a couple of notable exceptions. I think from my experience being around among the poorest people in the country who reside in public housing, the solutions largely are going to be in appropriations and in alteration to the tax distributions in this country. And they are the two barriers that most of us have had the greatest difficulty dealing with. Also, it seems that some of the opposition to liberal programs is now centered in what's broadly called the South. And I was wondering how the Forum and others interested in this issue are going to tackle that. I mean, they might start looking at the Republican budget that just came out, looking for signs of poverty support there. I think you're going to find it difficult. But how are you going to penetrate this is Republican caucuses that are opposed to many of these social programs, and how you're going to penetrate the appropriations committees, which is really where much of the solution lies, at least the starting solutions.
Thank you. Use my prerogative as a chair here to add a question and comment very briefly. My question, which I don't think we'll get to, but it's very important, there are enormous racial gaps in poverty, education, wages, and wealth. Yet we live in a so-called post-racial or colorblind society, and so how do you attack specific issues? When the data say that race matters, yet rhetoric says that it doesn't. How do you square that circle? It's a really challenging issue. And then just my comment is on relationships between poverty and education. It's really remarkable. Poverty rate is actually 54% for people who don't have if the household there's less than a high school education, 28% if they have some high school, and only 8% if there's some college or more. It seems like we might want to think about amplifying the education priorities given those enormous correlations between education and poverty. Okay, so we're going to take final comments from each of the speakers. I'm going to start with David and work my way back.
Great, thanks, Ray. Well, thank you for all these very enlightened comments and for being here. Just two things quickly. One, it strikes me the importance of experience to try mobilizing people behind issues of poverty, that arguments only get you so far, and that much like Jim's point about diverse communities that he grew up in, I'm particularly concerned about not just the economic inequality of the country, but segregation by where people live, go to school, and even worship. And that real contact with people of a different income is in many ways the experience, and that contact is what motivates people to truly become motivated to do something about poverty. The one interesting thing about the recession is not just within individual households, but the number of individuals who have a family member who they are then loaning money to or trying to help in some in-kind way puts people in contact with economic insecurity in ways that either directly or now indirectly they never have been before. And I really just uplift the idea of experience in every way as the way to ingrain a care for this issue in a way that arguments cannot. And then lastly, I really do think when we look at the debates coming up, UI, unemployment insurance reform is the key part of Obama's Department of Labor proposals as they move forward. TANF next year, minimum wage and living wage proposals, all of those have some dependence on workforce attachment. And in a time when unemployment is rising, if you can raise the minimum wage as high as you want, but people aren't getting the number of hours, it doesn't make the same kind of difference. UI reform requires people to be involuntarily terminated, but people are coming and going in jobs, hourly workers, at such a rate that needs to be reformed. TANF has the same type of requirement for work now 10 years ago. If we look at TANF reform, we really need to think about what you do with programs in a world where unemployment is rapidly rising. Thanks.
Thank you.
So first, let me just say that I think David has made a very good, important point. I wish we had more time for discussion of it, but I very much agree that in a lot of ways the decision that was made in the 1990s was to move to what people sometimes refer to as a work-based safety net. And it's really guided by the premise that people who are able to work generally should be in the workforce, and then we should have policies to make work pay. I think there is pretty broad shared agreement on that as a value. it plainly has a whole set of new implications at a time when we have enormous, high and rising unemployment, and it is going to be one of the challenges of the coming year, and perhaps number of years. Let me just very quickly say, in response to a few of the comments that were made, on the issue of elderly poverty, I think it's right that too often elderly poverty doesn't get attention in our poverty discussions. We recognize that children are the poorest group, that there was, in fact, dramatic progress in reducing elderly poverty, and too often the conversation ends there. We don't yet know what the implications of this last couple of years are going to be on the elderly poverty rate, but what is clear is with a better measure of poverty, we would see higher elderly poverty, particularly if we give weight to medical expenses and what that means for family income. I should also just note that there are 1.8 million elderly people age 75 and over who are poor, overwhelmingly female. That is something where it ought to be possible for people to come together in policy and do something about that. Very, very quickly, I won't. Let me just quickly say on President Obama, it is right that when he was in Illinois, he was very actively engaged around a number of the issues that we've talked about today. There are an ambitious set of campaign proposals around poverty. A number of them were already reflected in the Recovery Act. A number of additional ones show up in the budget. It is, in many ways, an administration that is moving, I think, in an exciting, important way towards trying to address the issues. I do think it would help to be more explicit in helping the American public understand what they're doing and why.
Thank you.
Just three brief comments. First, I do believe that this personal background in these issues can make a large difference in people's lives. Barack Obama's community organization received Catholic funding, okay? And I think it inculcated in him an appreciation of the role of religion in addressing, an irreplaceable role of religion in addressing social problems. That it is certainly true because George W. Bush has talked about his own struggles with alcohol in the context of his appreciation of faith-based institutions. I remember during the campaign in Iowa, he went to a Teen Challenge group and empathized, with real emotion with the kids that were recovering from addiction in those contexts, and I think it sensitized him. And I'd only say that there's a great organization in Britain that does social justice issues from the more conservative side called the Center for Social Justice. And one of their programs that they do is to take members of parliament, and they've taken from all three parties, and have them go into a low-income setting for a week. And the requirement is they can't bring a BlackBerry. And it is a good idea to kind of sensitize people on these issues. I would, on the other point of kind of blaming the poor, where they're not really poor, it may be, those are in every time unfair criticisms. But it may be a time with this recession where we get beyond some of those arguments. I'm involved with Bread for the World, and they find in their advocacy a lot less blaming of the poor when there are general economic problems, that it's not their fault because people understand that we're facing a common crisis, and it builds more of a kind of common ethic. And so I think that could be very positive in this circumstance. And then I guess I would just conclude, not to, all of these debates and important and proposals are important, but how important it is in an effort like this to understand that faith has often been seen as a source of social division in American politics. Okay? But the reality here is that it can be a source of civility, of concern for the common good, I've seen many faith traditions recovering their tradition, a great tradition of concern for the common good. If you look at evangelicalism in the 19th century, their focus was on abolition, or somebody like Shaftesbury's focus was on the poverty at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. These are great traditions that are being recovered, and that seems to me a profoundly hopeful thing.
Just to pick up on that, when a president or a politician or anyone becomes involved in this issue, it's usually because the issue has become personal for them. And poverty is not going to become a priority for us in this country unless it becomes personal for a lot more of us. When Jody talked about the sort of the problem of poverty is sexy overseas because we know poor children in poor countries, it's not their fault. There's a particular pain that comes from being poor in a very wealthy country. When every day metrics of success are flashed at you that are so far beyond your capacity to meet. And you've got to spend time with mothers who tell you about the 2 or 3 jobs they're working, and that it takes so much time they can't put their kids to bed at night, and yet they don't make enough money from the 3 jobs to support their kids. So it gets personal when you actually stop listening to all of the mythologies and rhetoric, and you actually make poverty visible, at least to you. Poverty isn't visible. That's why I respect Nick Kristof so much. He goes to all the places, the forgotten places and the forgotten people of the world. And that's where he does his vocation as a journalist. And he often meets there, first of all, people of faith. And Nick is himself kind of a seeker. He's not sure about the faith stuff, but he says, man, I had to rethink my notion of faith, because who's there when I show up? And about the whole, we have found a milestone. We have achieved a milestone in the first African American president of the United States. I'm kind of was with the older generation of black people in my neighborhood who didn't think it would happen. To be honest, there was a real generational gap. So young blacks thought it could and would. Older blacks didn't think it could and would. And until Pennsylvania, that night, my house was full of 20-somethings and me, and they were all sure that we won, and I wasn't sure until Pennsylvania. And then I watched for a while to make sure. Because, in my neighborhood, the first time I met Hillary Clinton was in a White House, one of those First Lady things on youth homicide, and I went over there and had a good talk about this problem. And I came home to where I live, and there was yellow tape outside, again, where a kid had gotten shot and killed during the meeting at the White House. And for me, it's been important to live in a place where yellow tape comes out, because it's no longer an issue. It's personal. Now, in Columbia Heights, there still are shootings occasionally, but now, the mayor's there like that, and the city council and the media. Why? Because white people moved in. And now we got Bed, Bath, and Beyond. And so there's recommendations here about the criminal justice system and reentry. If you think we're in a post-racial, colorblind society, look at the statistics on criminal justice, all of them. The Bible suggests the place to look to the truth about a society is not at the top, but at the bottom. What's happening at the bottom reveals more of the truth about any society than what's at the top. So don't get me preaching here. It's C-SPAN, and they won't know what to do with that. But I think there are. I love the term spotlight on poverty. It's time to put a spotlight on poverty, and because of this recession, and because of this president's commitment, and because of the change, and because the poor have been the other for so long. The poor are becoming your friends and neighbors and parishioners. And now churches I talk to, megachurch pastors, got poverty in their churches. And that could change us. So we don't want to miss the opportunity for change. And our project was just a bit of a pilot project, but it highlights the possibility of really making a spotlight on poverty in this country. And that's, I think, what we hope and pray for. Thank you.
It's no accident that we had the Reverend speak last here today. So with that, please join me in thanking all of our